On today's show, what's the worst move the Cavs have made in the last 5 years? Well, ESPN told us what they think it is. I'll tell you if I agree. Plus, how much Koby Altman has grown as an executive since the previous 5 years before this stretch. So it's all straight ahead on today's edition of Locked On Cavs.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, everybody? My name's Danny Cunningham, and you might know me from my time covering the Cleveland Cavaliers, places like my Substack, The Inside Shot, Cleveland Magazine, 92.3 The Fan, and a number of other stops along the way. I want to say thank you to you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen today and every day. You can find the show anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else. And if you're watching the show on YouTube as we get started here, do us a favor, hit that thumbs up button for us, click subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the latest Locked On Cavs content, a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode, of course, is brought to you by FanDuel, because right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That is $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins with FanDuel. The other day, ESPN put out a story. This was by Zach Cram, and I thought this was a great idea, and it's something I wanted to touch upon today. And essentially, so many teams in the NBA have found themselves in the position that they are in because of some really catastrophic mistakes. And there are teams that have become great teams in spite of some catastrophic mistakes. And there have been other teams that have maybe not made as big of a mistake, but they're still not good teams. And of course, this is not the be all end all, but I did think it was interesting. And I want to preface this conversation by talking a little bit about Koby Altman. And I know I had a lot to say about him a couple of weeks ago when he signed his contract extension and the entire Cavs front office was extended through the 2030 season, which I think is very well deserved. And the Cavs are in a great place because they have Koby Altman. They're a better organization with Koby Altman. I think you could make the case they're a better run organization right now than they have been than at any other time in franchise history. That's not to say that, and maybe this will be one of the best teams ever. I anticipate that it will. But I just think that the health of the organization right now is better than it's ever been than with anybody else in charge throughout the 50 plus year, I guess 60 plus year history of the franchise at this point. So I do think that is important to denote. But ESPN, what they did, what Zach Cram over at ESPN did, was he went through every organization and essentially said, this is the biggest mistake that their decision makers made over the last 5 years. So starting in 2020 through present day. And you didn't have to scroll very far to see the Cavs. And I don't think that this is the only mistake that they've made. As I've mentioned quite a bit, no executive bats 1,000 when making these decisions. And I think Koby Altman has a pretty good average here. And I think it is evidenced by the fact that the Cavs had, according to ESPN, the least impactful big mistake. They were, out of 30 teams, their worst mistake was ranked 30th. And according to ESPN, that biggest mistake was declining Isaiah Hartenstein's qualifying offer. This was back in 2021. And if you think back, Isaiah Hartenstein played 16 games for the Cavs in 2021. He had, I thought, a pretty good run in Cleveland. I thought he certainly showed some flashes of what he could be, but I don't think at that point he was the same player that he is today. And prior to being in Cleveland, he had been somebody that was a bit of a journeyman. He was in Denver. He had been in Houston and been waived. So it's not as if he was just some young, high potential guy. He was somebody that teams had already given up on. And I think a big part of the reason why the Cavs declined his qualifying offer was because what else did they do? They drafted Evan Mobley that year. That was the year Evan Mobley was the number 3 overall selection by the Cleveland Cavaliers. So do I look at this and say, yeah, that was a mistake? Like Isaiah Hartenstein, who at this point, considering what the next few years are and the fact that he has played since then, has played for 3 seasons. Do I think it is likely that if the Cavs had not declined his qualifying offer, do I think it's likely that the Cavs have Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley and Isaiah Hartenstein on the roster? I don't think so. I think at some point Isaiah Hartenstein or maybe Jarrett Allen would have been traded had Isaiah Hartenstein stayed in Cleveland, signed a new contract here, and done that. I don't think that the Cavs would have been able to keep all three of those guys. And of course, Evan Mobley is not going to be a guy that gets moved in any scenario that we look back at. So I think that is part of the reason why this is such a low impact mistake. And I do agree it was a mistake. I think at the time it was a little bit more challenging to see that it would be a mistake because hindsight, of course, is always 2020. But the fact that the biggest mistake, the quote unquote biggest mistake that Koby Altman and the Cavs have made is the least impactful big mistake. Again, big is relative here, but the least impactful big mistake in the NBA in the last 5 years, I think is a really interesting thing. Now, I don't think that that is the only mistake Koby has made in the last 5 years. And I do in a second want to talk about some of the mistakes that he made prior to the last 5 years, because this list dates back to 2020. So I do think that in this, you could include drafting Isaac Okoro with the number 5 overall pick as a potential mistake that Koby Altman made. Because if you look at who was available on the board at that time, and not to say that everybody that went behind Isaac Okoro would have been a fit in Cleveland. And that was I think it's a very strange draft because of the pandemic that was happening. And you didn't necessarily have the same ability to scout guys and work guys out and do all that stuff the way that you have been in every other NBA draft, basically ever. So I do think that sort of gives a bit of a pass. And it's not as if Isaac Okoro was a bad basketball player. It is just when you look at some of the guys that were selected after him. And of course, drafting Onyeka Okongwu would not have been the right thing to do for the Cavs at the time. And he went directly behind Isaac Okoro. Killian Hayes would have been a disaster. Obi Toppin, while also on his second team at this point, because the Knicks gave up on him, I do think has had maybe a better career than Isaac Okoro. Denny Avdia certainly has. Devin Vassell, who went 11th to the Spurs, is sort of the first guy that I look at and say, yeah, sort of a similar archetype to Isaac Okoro and somebody that I think of as a better player. That could have made more sense there. Like that is kind of the miss that I look at. Tyrese Halliburton went 12, and I do think that expecting the Cavs to draft a point guard for 3 straight years, considering 2018 they selected Colin Sexton, 2019 they selected Darius Garland. Drafting Tyrese Halliburton there wouldn't have made sense, but of course he's been, I think to this point, the second best player in this draft, only behind Anthony Edwards. But then you look at who went 14, Aaron Nesmith, who of course Cavs fans know very well from his time with the Indiana Pacers in this postseason. So I do think that there are a couple of guys that you can look at and say, yeah, maybe that was a mistake. Tyrese Maxey went later in that draft. Emmanuel quickly went later in that draft. Peyton Pritchard, who just won 6 Man of the Year. Jaden McDaniels. But I do think, and of course, Desmond Bane was number 30. I do think the further down you get, the more difficult it is for me to say, yeah, the Cavs should have done that instead of Isaac Okoro. I think it's easier to talk about it with the guys that went in the lottery still, because I think that some of those guys could have been in consideration for that number 5 overall pick. And then I do think you could make the case, and it's a little harder to say right now than I think it was 4 weeks ago, but Isaac Okoro's contract. Signing him to a 3-year contract extension worth $33 million was not a good contract. And I think that was a deal where they signed Okoro so they wouldn't lose him for nothing. And Isaac did not have a very fruitful market last offseason. If he would have, I think he would have signed a restricted offer sheet and maybe the Cavs would have matched it. Maybe they would not have. But the fact that they were able to get off of Isaac's contract without giving up draft picks in the trade for Lonzo Ball, I do think sort of negates that contract as a bad move. Like I certainly would not put it in the good move category, but I also look at it and say, okay, well, within 12 months of it, the Cavs were able to get off of that mistake and I think improve their roster while using it without having to use any draft capital. So I do look at that and say, okay, maybe this wasn't as big of a mistake. But the fact that we're talking about who Isaac Okoro, again, I think is a good basketball player, we're talking about that as like maybe the second biggest mistake of the last 5 years for the Cavs, speaks to how good things have been in Cleveland. That speaks to Koby Altman and his front office staff have done a really, really, really good job with the hand that they've been dealt. They've not missed on very many moves at all. So I do think it sort of makes this list kind of challenging to put together. The fact that their worst move that they've made was declining a restricted offer for Isaiah Hartenstein. That's a pretty good place to be. Now, the one thing that I do think you could look at to say maybe, okay, what if we're doing this list 5 years from now? Or what if we're doing this list a year from now, where it's still from 2020 on? I do wonder if Ty Jerome walking in free agency makes the list. I wonder about that. Now, I think there's probably a little bit more to that story, but I do wonder if that is the move that we look back at and say, you know what, that was a Koby Altman mistake, because he's not had many of them. That could be one, or it could not be. We have no way of knowing, but that's the one move that happened this offseason, because I don't look at the Isaac Okoro trade and think, yeah, that's going to be a mistake, or signing Larry Nance Jr. is not going to be looked at as a mistake. But I do wonder if allowing Ty Jerome to walk is something that we'll look at and say, you know what, the Cavs screwed that one up. I don't know. You don't know. We have no way of knowing that until things play out years from now. But if there is one move from this offseason that could end up on one of these future lists, I think that might be it. Now, what did it look like prior to 2020? Because I think Koby Altman and his front office have grown a lot in the last 5 years, because the list of bad moves prior to 2020, since Koby Altman gained power in Cleveland, well, that's a much longer one. We'll dissect that next right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. And summer sports right now are in full swing. Whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action, so why not make it just a little bit more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. Getting sunburned sounds miserable. It's the last thing that I want. Plus, FanDuel, easy to use, fast to pay out, makes even regular season games, because that's all we've got right now, makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. You could be placing a same-game parlay. You could be watching a bet ride in the ninth inning. Whatever it is, FanDuel makes it feel like you are part of the action. Right now, if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's right. New customers can bet just $5, get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com. That is FanDuel.com today to get started. Thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen today and every day. Like I said earlier, you can find the show anywhere you get your podcasts, and that is the best way to support the show, is by subscribing to Apple, Spotify, or both, even if you want. And Koby Altman hasn't made very many mistakes from 2020 through the present day, but from the time he took control of the basketball operations department until 2020, Koby did make some mistakes. And I think that is certainly the way to look at this, as somebody who has grown, I think, quite a bit as an executive, as a lead decision maker, no matter whether his title has been general manager, as it once was, or now president of basketball operations. But if I look at the moves that Koby Altman made from the summer of 2017, when he took over for David Griffin, through 2020, when this list begins, I think it's a much longer list than what we're looking at from the last 5 years. Because I look at it and say, okay, well, hiring John Beilein, I think maybe is one of the biggest mistakes that Koby Altman made. And of course, maybe part of that was Dan Gilbert. I don't know. I was not around to know what that hiring process was like, but I do know that that was an absolute train wreck. That was a dumpster fire. That was probably the worst coaching hire in franchise history and one of the worst in NBA history, because it didn't work out to that extent. Drafting Dylan Windler, I understand the risk that it was and the sort of high upside swing for somebody at number 26 overall, but that was a mistake. Drafting Kevin Porter Jr., despite all of the red flags that he showed while in college at USC, at number 30 overall, I understand that was a risk that I think was sort of a high upside play, and I didn't necessarily disagree with the move at times. At the time, of course, that didn't work out. Drafting Colin Sexton is the one that I look at and say, if there was one move in Koby Altman's entire tenure that he'd like to have a mulligan on, I would bet that's the one. And in similar vein to Isaac Okoro, it's not that Colin's not a good player. And of course, Colin is the reason why Donovan Mitchell is on the Cavs. But when I look at that draft, I look at who went pretty close to Colin in the draft in sort of a what could have been situation with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He was selected in that draft 11th overall. Colin went 8th. The Los Angeles Clippers picked SGA, and of course, he only spent 1 year there before the Clippers traded him as part of a package that returned Paul George. And that trade for the Thunder, one of the best deals in NBA history, because now SGA has developed into somebody that just won the MVP, and I don't think is going away and is regarded as, at worst, a top 5 player in basketball. Now, you can also say, well, the Cavs don't have Donovan Mitchell if they make that trade different, or if they make that draft pick differently. And you'd be right. That would be a true thing. But I also think that the Cavs might be in a better spot if they had SGA instead of Donovan Mitchell, because SGA is an MVP. And this is coming from somebody who thinks Donovan Mitchell has been a top 7 player in basketball since the Cavs traded for him. It's just SGA has been a top 3 player in basketball in that same time frame. So I do think if Koby Altman could have one mulligan, that might be it. That might be the one that you look at and say, yeah, if he got a do-over for that pick, I definitely think he would choose to do that one differently. And again, it's not that Colin is not a good basketball player, because he is. It's just when you draft somebody that amounts to essentially a 6th man with the number 8 overall pick, when somebody who wins an MVP and who knows could win more MVPs in the future, I don't think that would be, I think it would be foolish to rule that out for SGA. Goes 11th. I think that becomes the one that you look and see, yeah, it's probably one that he would like to have back. And then the other one that I look at is, and this is kind of an unfair one to put on Koby Altman and to put on this front office, because at the time things were in flux. Like, this was right after Koby Altman took command of the front office, but the Kyrie Irving trade. And of course, Kyrie was sent to Boston for that pick that did become Colin Sexton. And the Cavs got a little bit unlucky, thanks in part to Kenny Atkinson, because that Brooklyn Nets team, who that's what the pick was from, it was an unprotected Brooklyn pick that originally was sent to Boston as part of the Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce trade way back when, and then was sent to Cleveland as part of the Kyrie Irving trade. When that pick was acquired by the Cavs, the thinking was, okay, this is going to be a top 3 pick in a draft that has Luka Doncic and DeAndre Ayton, and Trae Young was in that draft. Like, it was a loaded draft, and the Cavs were supposed to be a team that had a top 5, top 3 type pick in it, because Brooklyn was supposed to be that bad. Well, that Brooklyn Nets team, of course, ended up being better than anybody anticipated. And of course, they didn't make the playoffs or anything, but they won more games. They had worse lottery odds, and the pick for the Cavs ultimately fell at number 8 as opposed to number 1, 2, 3. And I do think if that pick falls differently, we look at the trade much differently. If the Cavs were able to, draft Luka Doncic in that deal, I think we look at things just a little bit differently than the reality that we're living in with how that trade actually turned out. But I do think that having to be the first real big move for a front office to make after assuming power, I think is a really, really challenging position to be in. And that's what Koby Altman was in. And I just think the fact that I could rattle off right there 5 moves that I think all of those were more significant and bigger misses than the Cavs declining Isaiah Hartenstein's qualifying offer in 2021. I think that really speaks to how much Koby Altman and how much this front office really has grown since taking command. Because in that first few years, there were some rough mistakes, and there are certainly some other ones that I could pull up here. These are just the ones that immediately came to mind and say, yeah, he had, I don't want to say a rough couple of years, because you are taking more swings when you're in the midst of a rebuild the way the Cavs were. But look at the Colin Sexton draft pick. The Cavs have not had a miss like that since. They've not. And I think that is a real testament to this front office, and I think it should be something. The fact that that is true, and we're talking about the worst move the Cavs have made in the last 5 years being declining Isaiah Hartenstein's qualifying offer, I think that should breed a lot of confidence into what direction the Cavs are going to be going, not just this year, not just the year after that, but for as long as Koby Altman is in charge in Cleveland, I think you should feel pretty good about where things stand with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Now, I went through the rest of the list that ESPN put out, and there are some bad swings and misses that teams made. And I do think it does serve as a reminder of just how good Cavs fans have it with the current executive team. We'll talk about those next right here on Locked On Cavs. Thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen today and every day. If you're watching the show on YouTube, hit that thumbs up button for us, click subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the latest Locked On Cavs content. And the Cavs have made their fair share of mistakes. I don't think they've made very many of them, and the mistakes they've made have not been all that large. But Zach Cram at ESPN put together a list of every team in the NBA, their worst mistake in the last 5 years. The Cavs ranked 30th, and I wanted to go through some of the top 10 because some of these are so dauntingly bad that it just does serve as a reminder. Okay, the Cavs maybe have screwed up some small things, but there are some other teams that have put themselves in real bad situations because of some of the moves they've made. And the number one mistake on this list, I think everybody can guess it if you haven't read this story, but it's the Dallas Mavericks trading Luka Doncic. Like, that is a deal that I could not believe when it happened. I still kind of can't believe it. I think that is fairly the number one mistake. The only pushback I would say is, well, we haven't seen how everything played out. And I do think that, unfortunately, we are going to look at Dallas drafting Cooper Flagg as like part of that, even though it wasn't. And I just think more than anything, the Dallas Mavericks got incredibly fortunate that they got some lottery luck that we were once upon a time used to seeing the Cavs get. Number two was the Phoenix Suns trading for Kevin Durant and Bradley Beal, both in 2023. See, I look at these and in my mind, I separate them. Like, I think the Bradley Beal deal was way worse than the Kevin Durant trade. The Kevin Durant trade, and really I think both of these were sort of new owner syndrome type deals, right? With Matt Ishbia taking command of Phoenix and then hours later deciding to go all in for Kevin Durant, trading Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Jay Crowder, 4 unprotected first-round picks, plus a swap in order to get Kevin Durant. And I don't know that that is necessarily the problem. I think the rest of the roster around it was a problem, in part because they traded Chris Paul for Bradley Beal, and more importantly, Beal's no trade clause and more than $200 million that were left on his deal. So it's so funny how wide the gap is between a deal like that, between a huge, just absolutely monstrous mistake like that one and the Cavs. And I think the thing that really is in common with the 3 biggest mistakes, and number 3 ESPN has, is the Milwaukee Bucks trading for Damian Lillard, which was a move that I did not like at the time, did not think it was going to make the Bucks true championship contenders. I thought it took away a lot of what made the Milwaukee Bucks, because they were a defense first team. And of course, Damian Lillard is not a good defender whatsoever. But all 3 of these teams, between Milwaukee, Phoenix, and Dallas, were in the finals within 2 years of making disaster moves. And I think that this serves as a reminder of, you can do everything right to build your team, because Phoenix did to that point. Well, I'm not going to say everything right, because they did draft DeAndre Ayton over Luka Doncic. And had they drafted Doncic, I think this list probably looks a little bit different. And I think Phoenix as a franchise looks a lot different, but it can all come crumbling down with one really bad big move. And the Cavs have not made a bad big move. They're going to have to make a big move at some point in the future. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know when it's going to be, but they're going to have to make another big move. And hitting on those is so much more important. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you this, but you know how important hitting on that type of move is. Trading for Damian Lillard ultimately was part of the reason why the Milwaukee Bucks have sunk to where they are, to the point where they had to waive and stretch him in order to sign Miles Turner and still be like the 7th or 8th best team in what is not a good Eastern Conference. The Phoenix Suns are going to enter probably 4 or 5 years before they make the playoffs while having Devin Booker in his prime. The Dallas Mavericks got lucky because they won the lottery, but had they not done that, I think they would be looking at a very long, painful road back especially trying to have to rebuild their fan base. The Sacramento Kings, they're number 5 on this list. They traded both Tyrese Halliburton and De'Aaron Fox away within 3 years. Tyrese Halliburton has become somebody that can lead a team to the finals. The Sacramento Kings have had some really impressive point guards lately, and all they do is trade them away. So I look at a lot of these franchises and I think, man, the Cavs have really done a very good job as far as decision-making goes. They deserve a lot of credit for it because one wrong move and you find yourself on the wrong end of this list. The Cavs are at number 30. They've not made a lot of mistakes. They'll make mistakes again at some point. I don't know when. I don't know how big. But the fact that they've gone 5 years with a pretty clean ledger on big decisions, I think is a really impressive thing. And I think it is something that should give a lot of confidence into Cleveland for the future, as long as Koby Altman is running the show, because I think he has proven that he's doing a pretty good job operating the Cleveland Cavaliers. And thank you for making today's edition of Locked On Cavs your first listen. And thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find the show anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else. Make sure to drop us a 5-star rating, leave us a nice review, and of course, be a friend. Tell a friend about Locked On Cavs. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure a friend is subscribed as well. And if you're watching the show on YouTube, do us a favor. Hit that thumbs up button for us as we get out of here. Click subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the latest Locked On Cavs content. I'll be back tomorrow talking more about the Cleveland Cavaliers.